Okay, so this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I'll be uh, totally clear about that. This also builds off of Christina's talk, if you saw that earlier. There are several concepts that she mentioned in that I was planning on mentioning in mind. But I know that if you've attended that session, then I can actually start at a little bit of a different level, or I can vector into it a little bit differently. So hopefully there won't be too much repeat in this, and let's get started. So I really think that deception itself is one of these things that is just intertwined with humanity. And I'll go ahead and give you the obligatory Sun Tzu quote now, which is that all warfare is based on deception. And I really believe that fundamentally every human is both a master deceiver, and we are also very, very easily deceived. And I typically don't get any pushback on the second one, that we all fall for things. I think we're all smart enough to know that we all fall for things, but I have heard people say, wait, I'm not a master deceiver, or I've met this other person and they're not any good at deception. But I'll disavow you of that in just a minute. So here's what we're going to talk about. We'll talk about are we wired for deception, how our minds can be hacked and hijacked, what we need to be on the lookout for, and then ultimately how we adapt and do better, specifically within our organizations, but I'll try to throw some personal stuff out there as well. So here's where I said I'll disavow you of this notion that we're not all master deceivers. I really, when I look at the way that we are formed and raised as humans, what I see is that at the very beginning of our life, we have this propensity to want to trick people. If you've ever seen that gleam in the eye of a baby or a toddler when they're trying to get away with something, you know that they understand exactly what they're trying to do. And they naturally came to the conclusion that I could try to do something that somebody else would not be able to figure out, and that will be to my advantage in some way. So this comes to us very, very, very naturally. And then we might think, well, certainly we teach people not to lie. And I would counter that. And I would say we actually teach people to lie. And I'll give you two examples. One is, let's say you're parenting a child and you send that child in to go brush their teeth before they go to bed. What typically happens, because most kids don't like to brush their teeth, the movements feel awkward. It's a lot of training that has to go in. They'd rather spend time playing Legos or something else. And so they want to minimize that time. So they just go in the bathroom, shut the door, and then come out and say, I did it. When in fact, of course, they haven't. And then we usually go, well, I can tell that you didn't. And then that leads to a discussion. And you usually end up telling them how you could tell. Well, you weren't in there very long. And then you go in and I can, feel your toothbrush and I can tell it's not even wet. And then, so what that does is that now embeds training. Now they know, oh, okay, if I want to get away with this, I can stay in the bathroom a little bit longer and I can run the toothbrush under the water for a little bit. And so they begin to train. And of course, as a parent, you still know better the first few times or so that they try to get away with that, because they're still not that great at it. And they're still, mess around their face and everything else. So that's one example where they're trying to get over on you. What about an example where we actually tell them that lying is the right thing to do? So I'll ask you a simple question. How many of you really want to hear every opinion that a child has? Not very many people. And we also know that there are some opinions that are not polite or right to share in society. And so what do we as parents do? We say, well, if that's what you're going to say, we either don't say it, which is probably the right thing because that's not encouraging deception, or just say the thing that's going to be socially appropriate. And one of the things that's almost universal is we all tend to, get drug to a family reunion or drag somebody else to a family reunion, and you hear the kicking and screaming of somebody going, I don't want to go to that. I'd rather, spend time doing X, Y, and Z. And what does the parent say? Well, I don't care. What you're going to do is you're going to act like you want to be there. You're going to smile. You're going to shake crazy Uncle Bob's hand and say, I'm glad to see you. You're going to do all of these things. And so what we're doing is we're training our children to continue to put on the mask and to become expert social engineers within society. In fact, we have words for people that don't conform to that. We call them antisocial. We call them people that we ostracize from society, people who are too forward, too out there, too expressive of their opinions that might be contrary to everybody else's. So we enforce conformity regardless of whether somebody believes in that or not. So we build this in over and over and over up to the point where the most sophisticated of us are asked these questions. Something like, do these jeans make my butt look fat? And then all these computers go off within our mind of how do I evaluate this situation? What's the right answer in this situation? Do I give the truth? Do I give the falsehood? What's the socially appropriate thing to do? What's going to keep me in society? What's going to ostracize me from society? And then out comes the answer, right? So this is something that's woven into us at so many levels. And I'll start us off with an experiment. You're probably sophisticated enough that you've seen this example, but in just about any audience that I give it to, that even an audience like this, it might be only a third or a half that have seen it. So for the other half of you, this is going to be the first time you've seen this, and then I'll explain exactly what's going on. So imagine we're in an auditorium and there's 1,000 of us in there. At this point, I would say, all right, everybody stand up. Now, what I'm going to do is a simple experiment with these cards. And what I want you to do is pick a card, lock a card in your mind, get that do not forget the card, because every card trick sucks if you forget your card. And these are going to go away in 3, 2, 1. And then again, now, if we were in that auditorium, I would say, and at this point, if your card is gone, now sit down. And what you would see is this wave of people sitting down. There might be 1 or 2 stragglers that stand up, but those people are just plain wrong. And we'll show you why in a second. So if you've not seen this before, what you're thinking is, how did he push me into picking the card that he was going to remove? Or how did he know which card everybody would pick? So here's how that works. We started with what's on the top. So it's a King of Hearts, King of Spades, Queen of Hearts, Jack of Diamonds, Jack of Clubs. And then here's what we ended with on the second row. And of course, if you compare those, what you'll quickly realize is, yeah, those are 2 completely different sets of cards. But what I did is I rushed you through the process so that you got one image in your mind, that card that you locked on, that you decided was your card, and you completely ignored and forgot and discarded the mental images of everything that else was there. It just kind of blended into a mush. And so at that point, you kind of get hit with this state of wonder, because your reality was that I chose your card, or I pushed you into choosing a very specific card. And that's because our minds are really, they're wired to present reality to us based on all the different inputs that we have. And that makes sense. We have all these different inputs in that represents reality. But in reality, all that input is filtered through context. And I heard Christina mention this as well. We contextualize all that based on our upbringing and our worldviews and the prior information that we've received that day or beforehand. our social standing, our social structures, the disciplines that we have, the fields that we work in, all of that comes in and it informs the way that we interpret things. And of course, that can be manipulated. That's what a social engineer does, is that social engineer manipulates or plays into the reality that somebody is feeling at that time. But I interpret data subtly different than you interpret data, and you interpret data subtly different than anybody else does, which means that we all have these little micro differences in the way that we perceive the world around us and in the way that we perceive and react to information. So the technical term for what I forced you into was a condition called change blindness. This is where you have so much attention on one thing that you deprioritize cognitively everything else around that. There's a lot of examples to this. I would encourage you to go to YouTube later on and just go do a search for change blindness and person swap, or change blindness and invisible gorilla. That's a really famous experiment with that as well. But I just want to expose you to those ideas very, very quickly. So moving through, how does all of this work and why does it work in the first place? Let you sit with that for a second. Yeah, I mean, there are little things that our mind does to kind of warp things in pre-computed ways. This is what we would call heuristic thinking. So when your mind immediately sorts the words on that top line into the right order, and you only realize that it did that interpolation after somebody tells you that it did, well, then you know that it's pretty easy to be fooled, right? You know that your mind is creating a reality and actually superimposing different images into your mind than what reality has. I mean, if any of you have ever, looked outside and maybe you saw a big pile of leaves, but you didn't realize that it was a pile of leaves, and you saw in your mind an animal like a rabbit or something, and misinterpreted, mistook that pile of leaves and twigs for a rabbit. What your mind actually does is it starts to look and say, oh, that shape could be, and then it takes a shortcut and goes, oh, that basic shape equals rabbit. And then it takes a kind of a generic image of a bunny and puts that over into the way that you're receiving all that information. So you may actually believe that you're seeing hair and the gleam from an eye and everything else. And then only after you have time to sit with it and really start to puzzle out what that is, does the resolution come through to where you can start to interpret that thing the right way. And this is because of what behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman called System 1 and System 2 thinking. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for his work in behavioral economics and is actually considered the father of that discipline. And so what Kahneman says, and I think general psychology backs this up, is that there are really two modes in which we think. There's a very fast mode of thinking that is all around these heuristics that lead to errors. The things like that Morpheus picture or earlier, where our mind pre-sorts the sentence based on what it really perceives is trying to be communicated there. And System 1 is constantly looking at all of the telemetry data around us. And it's really good because it saves us from analysis paralysis. It's very fast. It's working through shortcuts and pre-computed routes and algorithms and heuristics and all of that kind of stuff. That's just in our minds. Those pathways are built. You show a stimulus, you immediately get a response. And like I said, that's great. It saves us from analysis paralysis. But the downside is that every now and then you look at a pile of leaves and you see a bunny, or you read an email and you come to one conclusion because you had a preconception of what somebody was going to say, or you accidentally skipped over a line, or you didn't have the right amount of context and you read it and you came to one conclusion, and then 20 minutes later you reread it and you come to an entirely different conclusion. That's system one at work. Saves us a lot of time, saves us a lot of effort, stops us from over processing things and getting so overwhelmed that we can't continue with life, but it leads to these kind of errors. System two is much slower. It's more methodical. It feels like solving a math problem, and our minds don't like it. So system one, about 95% of our thoughts and actions, which is great, but bad, because that also means that 95% can be hacked and hijacked pretty easily. In system two, about 5%, our minds don't like it. And even when we're there, our mind is wanting to push back into system one and say, oh, I can take a shortcut here. I can make it easier here. Let me go back to the easy thing. But as Christina said, the good news is that if you're in system two, you can actually codify a system two behavior or line of thinking into system one through repetition or through reward or through release of certain chemicals within the brain associated with reward, like dopamine. So all of that can almost immediately just form a habit, push something back into system one and make that a very repeatable behavior. And so there's good news and bad news with all of this. One of the negative effects is cognitive bias. And I think we all know that. We've seen that in effect on Facebook and LinkedIn and everything else over the past several years. Cognitive bias is the effect of all of these pre-computed routes within our minds that cause us to perceive the world differently and to receive facts differently and interpret those differently. And of course, social engineers can take advantage of all that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But not only do social engineers take advantage of that, everybody does. I take advantage of that in the way that I work with people around me. Parents do in the way that they work with their kids. Religious organizations do, corporations do, governments do, political organizations do. It is just one of the things we do, because if you can save the time of communication and not have to make all the different logical arguments to a certain camp of people, well, then naturally you can accomplish more faster, right? So there are good things in that you can accomplish more faster, but there are bad things in that whenever we are confronted with things that are outside of the bias ecosystem that we're living in, we tend to automatically reject it. And that's not a great result. The other thing is a lot of these biases leave us open to very, very intentional dark manipulation. We see that in the marketing world through systems like anchoring, where they'll say, how much would you expect to pay for this? $500? And the thing is actually worth, less than 100, but they've anchored that price point in your mind. And so now when they tell you it's only $350, you feel like you're getting a great value. And so there's lots of ways to play with that. If you're just starting to do research on bias now, look up, the halo effect, the demon effect, look up framing bias, look up anchoring. There's tons and tons of really, really interesting roads that you can go down exploring this. But for my purposes, I typically think of biases in a little bit more chunky categories. So biases that affect the way that we remember things, the way that we process social interactions, the way that we learn, the types of things that we believe and would readily believe, the way that we orient around our finances, and then of course a lot of the political stuff that we see going on. Biases, and I'll say this about as clearly as you can say it. Biases are why you see these people on Facebook and and it's your holiday dinner table just arguing tooth and nail with each other over the same set of facts, but interpreting that set of facts completely differently. Or somebody gets presented with a new set of facts that contradicts their pre-established belief system. And what they end up doing is saying, well, yeah, I'll have to think about that. But I just believe what I'm going to believe. And so what they are able to do then is dismiss all these new facts and just hold to the frame. And this is a pretty famous and relevant quote by the founder of Frameworks, which is a political and social consulting organization. And she says, if the facts don't fit the frame, it's the facts that people reject and not the frame. And I think we see this over and over and over again in society, that this actually happens in lots of different areas. I mean, one of the things that I do outside of the world, of security that I live in is I do mentalism. Sometimes I build that into keynotes and other things like that. There are certain effects that you can do that you build a frame around. You say, here's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to read body language, or I'm going to use the scientific principle to do something or something else. And then you do the effect using an entirely different set of skills, usually based in the magic world or the conjuring world. And then ultimately what somebody that's already bought into that belief system that you've sold, which is you're going to use, NLP or eye movements or something else. They then explain everything that you did through that lens. And when you say, no, I actually did something different, they'll argue with you about it. They'll go, no, but you had to have, noticed that this person looked up and to the left whenever they did that, or you had to, one of the things that I've had people do is they actually remember things in reverse order. So if somebody tells me a piece of information and then I reveal that later on in a way that looks like I had somehow predicted it, what they'll remember is that I showed them my prediction first before they told me what they were going to say. And it's all based on the mental frame that they've established in their mind about what I'm doing and what, why and how I'm able to do that. So all of this comes into a model that we call the OODA Loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. This was created by a guy named John Boyd, who was a fighter pilot trainer in the Air Force a few decades ago. And what this means is that at all times we're receiving all this telemetry data. So we're observing the world around us, we're seeing things, we're hearing things, we're taking in all this information. We then orient around that. That's that addition of context and worldviews. Based on that interpretation, we then decide what we're going to do, and we're going to act on that. That sounds pretty procedural and pretty intentional, but that's not how it works, right? The way that it works is that this is happening multiple times per second automatically within our brain, unconsciously, or just there. It's an automatic process. And so this, the way that you can hijack that is, of course, you can deal with the observational piece. I can feed fake data, or I can play into or exploit a bias or preconception or something related to a worldview. I can exploit the way that you orient around certain pieces of data. And so here's just my quick list on the right of how you do that. You manipulate facts, withhold facts, manipulate somebody's context, manipulate their attention, exploit a known bias, evoke emotion in some way to keep them over in system one as much as possible, feed them a truth sandwich, which is what I call, starting with a true statement, continuing with a true statement, something that's psychologically comforting, ultimately moving to where you inject the thing that you want them to believe. The poison pill is the way that I think about it, and then build back out to true or psychologically comforting things. Ultimately, what that does is it buries that deceptive piece so deep in comfort and confirmation bias that somebody doesn't really remember it, or they rationalize it away. The way that you may have seen this in social engineering at work would be like somebody starts off with very easy things for somebody to confirm, or they compliment somebody's character. So very, very comforting. And then they go, oh, what I need you to do right now is because we need to check this, check out your system configuration. Just, type in this URL, go to this website, and let me know when you get there. And of course, that's the poison pill at that point. Then the social engineer on the phone with them finishes up that part, and then they close out of that, and then they quickly go on to other things that are more comforting again and more confirming again. And then by the end of that, the participant that just fell victim to something is usually thanking the person that led them through that process. Or if something felt a little bit hinky as they were going to that URL, by the time they end the phone call, they've pretty much forgotten it, or they've rationalized it away because this entire interaction, other than that, felt so great. And then lastly, you can leverage the Cialdini principles. That's the psychological principles from Robert Cialdini and the psychology of persuasion, which just had a refresh this year. So I'd encourage you to get that. It was 6 principles before 2021, and now there's an added one that actually came out first in Persuasion. So he goes through things like reciprocity and liking and authority. And then the new one that was added was the unity principle. This is the idea of tribalness or tribiness, where we tend to reinforce each other's beliefs with the people that we like and that we hang around and that we want to associate with. And then here's what that OODA loop looks like if we were to explode that out into a schematic. So you see all this telemetry data come in. You see the orientation based on worldviews and new information and expectations or preconceived notions, the way that we're raised, our genetic heritage, all that affects the way that we orient and contextualize information. And then ultimately our mind decides, and then we finally act on that. So what do we watch out for? You're going to be pretty familiar with a lot of this, but just to reinforce some points. One of the things that the company I work for does is we publish these quarterly phishing reports. And one of the things that we do in that is we talk about the types of test phishing templates that people have been using and have had a lot of success with. And that's what you see on the right, and then, on the left. And then on the right, you see the ones that are more in the wild. And so what we see is that when people are testing, they're getting a lot of traction with, which means a lot of people clicking with things that are known and trusted. Look at these 3 social networks, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So LinkedIn at 42%, Facebook at 21%. So there you're 63%, add another 10% on top of that. For Twitter, you're at 73%. That is a lot of traction just based on those 3 networks. And it's based on pre-established relationships, which foster trust. And then the other thing that is embedded in those kinds of templates is something that's exploiting curiosity. There's always something like, John Doe just posted on your timeline, and there's no additional information, right? Because that's how those networks work. Because what they want to do is they want to open a curiosity gap in your mind. And curiosity psychologically is like an itch that needs to be scratched. Our mind does not want to rest until it's solved that puzzle of what does this mean? What happened? What is this missing piece of information? And so you're naturally more inclined to go ahead and click the link because, again, system 1 is all about saving cognitive load. It's about saving time and energy for us. And if there's a nice little link to click, rather than having to open a browser and type in a URL and then find the spot on my timeline and all that, if there's a nice one-click way of getting somewhere, well, then my hand is probably going to go ahead and almost involuntarily just go click that link because my mind is trying to solve this puzzle. And so we see this trust piece with the social network. We see the curiosity piece. There might even be a little bit of urgency. because you don't know what somebody is saying about you, or you're really interested in your online persona and you're wanting to make sure that you're getting in there and interacting socially, because if John Doe interacted with you, you want to get right on that and reward that person for being part of your network and keep that conversation going and try to keep the, whatever algorithm is looking at that, keep that bumping that into people's feeds, showing them that this is something that they should pay attention to. So there's a lot of things going on there. The other things that we'll talk about in a second is anything that capitalizes on urgency, or anything that invokes a strong emotion like fear, or anything that purports to feed or satisfy a hunger. And when I say hunger, I am meaning anything from an actual hunger like pizza to a financial hunger, needing, the need for money or success. So greed, to a more base hunger like lust. All of these are different hungers that our minds and bodies have that social engineers can take advantage of. Something that said, hey, check out these nude pictures from your favorite celebrity. All of a sudden, we know that there's a good portion of the population that maybe they don't even want to see nude pictures of that person, but they're just curious. Is this real? What was the situation where this person was found in? To, all the way to the people that really, really want to see that. So there's lots of things that go into that. And then on the in the wild things, you see a lot of things taking advantage of authority or fear, like your account's going to be terminated. Your CEO needs you to do something. So lots of that going on. And so the other thing is that when we're on social networks, we typically, or maybe we're better about this, I think, than most people are, but the general public is accidentally, giving away information all the time that's the keys to things like password resets. If you can get somebody into this, trivial, very social thing where they're posting answers and creating fun little bits of trivia about themselves, like their, what is your Star Wars name? What is your porn name? What is your, X, Y, and Z? And it is, the name of a street that you lived on when you were a kid, plus some other bit of information. Well, that's gold to a social engineer. All that could either be rolled into a very personalized phishing attack, or it can be used to, reset your password. A lot of these are basically the answers to password reset questions. So where I fall in is when it comes to social engineering, there's really these 6 pieces that I think about it. How do I use greed? How do I get a ticking time clock in there? How do I get some urgency? This is going to expire in X amount of time, so that person is less likely to close out or put it off. How do I invoke curiosity? So I get that mind, that curiosity gap going. When and where should I inject fear? Because that is a very strong system 1 driver. How do I invoke that person's self-interest? And so that goes back with greed or lust. That's that personal reward piece, or personal, social standing and other things like that. And then also, one of the things we see taken advantage of over and over and over again is helpfulness as well. And this prime example of this would be like after any national or global tragedy, like a hurricane. You'll see social engineers go ahead and on social networks or in phishing emails say, here's exclusive photos from hurricane whatever, or exclusive photos from this this shooting site, or they'll flip it. So that would be curiosity. If they're flipping it into helpfulness, it would be, help the victims of Hurricane X, give this amount now. And of course, it's not going to a legitimate charity. It's actually either going to download malware on your machine, or it's going to trick you into giving away money to something else, or giving away your credit card information, or giving away personal information that can be exploited later on. So I'm not saying don't give to those things. I'm saying absolutely give to those things, because we want to be good people, but don't click on a link in an email or in a social media post or something else. If you already know a good charity, go look up that legitimate site and give on that site. Maybe use those phishing emails as a reminder that you should go give to a legitimate charity. So delete the phishing email and then go do the right thing. Other things that we see is a lot of use of dark patterns, both by legitimate organizations and also cyber criminals. And so a dark pattern is an exploitation of the way that a user interface is designed, so that it more favors the organization that designed the application or the website than it favors the user. And so if you've ever accidentally subscribed to something that you didn't mean to subscribe to, it's probably because there was a dark pattern at use. If you've ever gone to unsubscribe to something and you've not been able to figure out how to do it, it's because there's a dark pattern at play there. And if something that should be associated with security and privacy is associated in something else in the menuing system on a social network, it's because they're using a dark pattern to make that harder to enable, to protect yourself. And so all of this is getting very, very prevalent, but we're also seeing cyber criminals use a lot of this. I should say, before I get to another fun example, one of the things that I'm seeing more and more of right now from legitimate companies is when you're trying to accomplish something that goes against that company's best interest or is not the preferred behavior that they want, they'll actually change the order of the buttons from something that's intuitive to you to something that's totally not intuitive. So if it's always been yes is on the right and no is on the left, they'll flip it to where no is on the right and yes is on the left, even though you're trying to do something that you want to do. Trying to unsubscribe from something might be like that. Are you sure you want to unsubscribe? Yeah, well, I went through 7 clicks to get to this unsubscribe page. And now you're asking me, but now you flip the buttons and you've highlighted the wrong button as well. So all the cognitive attention is being pushed into the wrong place. That's a good example of a dark pattern. Here's a couple of others that popped up on mobile a while back. These are advertisements. And of course, on mobile, we're used to our screens getting all grungy. And one of the things that the person that created these realized is they could play into that. And so you'll see over here on the left, they actually embedded a dust speck into the photo. And on the right, they embedded a straight hair. And so what do you do when you see that? You probably blow it off. I mean, this is system one at work. You see that, you go, and you still don't, your screen still looks dingy. So you might try to wipe it off on your clothing. But then after that doesn't work, you're frustrated enough that you use one of your fingers to try to smudge that thing off. And of course, because your mobile phone is a touch device, what you've then done is you've activated the ad, and at best you've given somebody some pay-per-click advertising revenue. At the worst, you've navigated to a site that's owned by a cyber criminal. You've either downloaded malware to your device, or you're being taken into some bigger kind of scam where they're going to try to do credential harvesting or get some other information out of you. So we do have to be aware of how our intention is being manipulated. What is the thing that we're focusing on, or that the attacker or the organization whose website we're on, or the person that's sending us this information, how are they trying to push our attention around? And how do we break out of system one and get into something that's a little bit more methodical, where we can think about it a little bit more rationally? I want to spend a couple minutes talking about disinformation, and then we'll talk about some best practices. And I know I'm getting close on time here. So I'll say on the disinformation front, fake news is not a helpful term. So I don't use that really. I go with the kind of the Cold War Russian term, which may or may not be helpful as well. But I think there's some good traction that we can get here. So the Russian word disinformatia, we get our word disinformation from that. And disinformation is just the intentional injection of a falsehood within some broader context, like a news source or a social group or something else. It is that intentional injection of a lie. Misinformation is when you or me or Aunt Sally or somebody else within the community picks that up, believes it, and then shares it to amplify that initial disinformation. So it's really important to realize that when you or I accidentally do it, that we're not creating disinformation, but the unintentional sharing of disinformation is misinformation. A couple of terms you may or may not be familiar with. One is astroturfing. So this is taken from the literal astroturf, which is fake grass that you may see on a sports field or in a store aisle or something else, trying to mimic real grass. Well, astroturfing in the disinformation world is associated with grassroots campaigns or grassroots groups that have actually been started under false pretenses, but which all or the majority of the members of that grassroots group are not aware of the fact that it was started under false pretenses. And so ultimately, the way or the reason or the person that started that has been obscured from them, and they're innocently participating in this thing. And in many times, these people believe that they're doing good, that they're serving a great purpose, that they know the truth and everything else. But ultimately, they would be confused at best, or maybe horrified at worst, to realize who or what was behind the actual beginning of the group that they're a part of. One of the ways that gets accomplished is through the use of things like sock puppet accounts, which I'm assuming most people here are familiar with. But if you think of a physical sock puppet, it is a thing you put your hand up. It's an inanimate object, and then you animate it, right? You give it a little bit of life, and that's ultimately what it is. But it's in the social media context. I create a fake Facebook account or a fake LinkedIn account or Twitter account or Instagram account. And then I breathe life into that. I add a profile picture, I add a background, I start making friends and connections across that. And then ultimately I cultivate the value of that over time. And usually the longer that's been established, the more value I get out of that. If you think about a sock puppet account that I might create on LinkedIn, give that basically, an intelligence operative background. This person went to this school, started at this agency, is up to the rank of X now. And then that person then starts to send out connection requests. They get a few people that accidentally accept the connection request without doing any validation of who that person is. Then other people connect to that person because they see that this person is connected to other people that they already know. So they infer trust into that. And then, maybe a year, 2 years, 5 years later, this person has a pretty reputable network, and they've been posting things, they've been resharing things. And then at that point, they either leverage all the information that they've been learning by seeing things. It's like, oh, this person values X. This person likes to post about Y. This person is going on a trip to a conference over here. And they find ways to utilize that, or they start to inject disinformation into their feed that they're hoping that these other people will pick up and believe and share or alter their intelligence plans based on. And then, of course, we've got all the deep fakes and cheap fakes, and the way that generative adversarial networks are working to create even more sophisticated AI-based fakes and videos and so on. But one of the really interesting things here is that we tend to focus a lot on the sexy AI stuff. We really are enamored with deep fakes and the fact that I can make an actor look like Vladimir Putin and create this really interesting political drama. But the vast majority of really damaging fakes that we've seen over the past several years have been what we would call cheap fakes. And this is, if you think about the OODA Loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, this is manipulating the orientation piece of something. So if I take a clip of one person, like a political figure, saying something in one context, and I take that 20-second clip out and I say that this person said it in an entirely different context, well, then now I can actually make people mad. I can create a lot of emotion around that. Or one of the other things that we saw, and I'm intentionally not being political about this or taking any sides. I'm just trying to give examples without giving a lot of names. One of the other examples we saw was a political figure who they had some video of, and they slowed the video down and then said that that person was drunk because it made it sound like their speech was slurred. And then so that went out and started to go crazy. So this is all with the tools that are pre-installed on our phones and computers and laptops and everything else. So really, really easy to do because it's usually feeding into a cognitive bias that a social group already has. And so they're going to see that, they're going to believe the pretext that video was positioned around, and then they're going to be inflamed with that. It confirms something, they've got confirmation bias going on, and then they share that out. And this is, just examples of that sharing. This happens through bot farms, and then also, flesh and bone troll farms as well. So it's not just all AI, but it's actually people that are behind this as well, amplifying and pushing and continuing all the different narratives and so on. Here are a few examples. The bottom left is AI generated models. So if you're thinking about creating a sock puppet account, you can go get a brand new face, a brand new body to go with that. You don't need to go rip off somebody else's profile picture or take a model from a magazine. You can start with a completely new one, fresh one that somebody can't do a reverse image search on and find out a whole bunch of other stuff. Bottom middle, that was actually the Nancy Pelosi video that I mentioned earlier that was slowed down. And again, I'm not taking political stances on this, so I'm showing examples from all across the political spectrum and all across the geographical spectrum as well. This was after the Parkland shooting in Florida. One of the survivors in that was posing for the cover of Teen Vogue, and she tore up a picture of a target that was used for shooting practice. And what somebody did then was take that photo and then superimpose the Constitution on it and purport that she was trying to tear up the Constitution. Now, I'm sure in that person's mind, that was the effect of the message that she was trying to give. But what that person did is they represented that as a true thing, that she was tearing up a physical constitution and was trying to say that nobody has any rights. And then so re-victimized and potentially re-traumatized somebody else who had already lived through a trauma by getting all this, hate rallied against that person. So use of technology, use of bias, use of all this together to spread lies. And then, as I said, all across the political spectrum, all across the social spectrum, all across the geographical spectrum. And we also see corporations do this. We see social media influencers do this intentionally, and to some extent, people like you and I may or may not do this as well every now and then. So how do we adapt? Last section. All right, so we typically think about security awareness. And I'll just say that security awareness and security behavior are not the same thing. The way that I think about it is that we have this knowledge, intention, behavior gap that most people don't account for. And I'll explain that in just a second. The way that the knowledge, intention, behavior gap works is that there's a gap between knowing something and intending to act on that knowledge. And then there's also a gap between intending to act on that knowledge and even actually doing it. So just because we Know something doesn't mean that we care enough to intend to act on it. And even when we intend to act on it, we don't always follow through. I mean, ask anybody that's filled out or created a New Year's resolution list. The vast majority of people fully intend to eat better, go to the gym more, spend their money more wisely, spend more time with family, do more things for their own self-care and so on. And within 2 weeks of creating that list, they're prioritizing everything in the moment. They're dealing with the fire that's in front of them rather than the thing that they want for their future reality. And so out of that knowledge, intention, behavior gap come what I call 3 realities of security awareness. Number 1 is just because I'm aware doesn't mean that I care. Number 2 is if we try to work against human nature, we will fail every single time. And number 3 is what our employees do is way more important than what they know. And I'll say it as clearly as I can here. What somebody has known has never stopped a breach. That knowledge, what's in our mind, doesn't stop a breach. It's what somebody does in the moment that determines whether you have a breach or not. Because I can do, I'll throw this up here for that. At any given moment, I can do the right thing even though I don't have the right information. I can just have a natural reflex, a natural behavior, an in-the-moment behavior that does the secure thing, even though I don't know why. Because maybe I saw that model. Maybe that's what everybody else does. And so it's just the pattern that I've seen. And I've picked that up culturally and I reflect that. The other thing is we all know that I can have all the right information in my head and still not do the right thing. I may know what a phishing email looks like. I may know how to interrogate headers. I may know how to do all these things. But if I'm tired, if I'm stressed out, if I'm angry, if I'm living in system 1 and that phishing email comes through at just the right time and just the right circumstances, even though I'm a longtime security professional, I am still probably vulnerable for those things, especially on a device like this that doesn't have the same interface as most of the device training that I've had over my career. And so all of this, we have to take it into account whenever we're trying to design for the behaviors that we want somebody to have. And speaking of the word design, I typically think of the field of behavior design, and I go back to the father of behavior design, which is a guy named B.J. Fogg. And he says, humans have 3 things really going for us, or not going for us, really. We're lazy, we're social, and we're creatures of habit. So lazy, system 1, right? We like to take the shortest path. We like to save time, save energy, conserve energy, and so on. We're social. We tend to reflect the behaviors of those around us, take on the mindsets of those around us. We like to be seen as good by those around us. And then we're creatures of habit. We like to do the things the way that we've always done them. And we typically repeat patterns of habit even when we don't think about it. So we're lazy, we're social, and we're creatures of habit. Fogg developed what's called the Fogg behavior model. And this is used by virtually every social media platform out there to increase engagement. And so this model basically talks about 3 elements. Behavior happens when 3 things come together at the same time: motivation, ability, and a prompt. Motivation ranges from low to high. Ability ranges from something that's hard to do to very easy to do. And then you have the prompt. That's the thing that in the moment asks somebody to do something, tells them to do something, invokes that feeling that they should, even if that's just an internal invocation. And so for a behavior to happen, you have to have the right amount of motivation, and the behavior has to feel easy enough at the time the prompt is given. And so we could spend a lot of time on this. I could spend hours just talking about the behavior model, but those are the basic components. This is like the E equals MC square of behavior. So the other thing to realize is there are times when a behavior could be really hard to do, and I can have all the motivation in the world to do it, but I can't accomplish that. You could be prompting me. I could be in a auditorium with 1,000 people, all cheering my name, and there's a 500-pound boulder on the stage, and they're saying, you can lift it, you can lift it, you can lift it. So I can have all that prompting. I can have all the motivation. I might even believe that I can, but I'm not going to be able to lift that thing. I think there are some security behaviors that are similar to that. We keep telling people to do things over and over and over, and we might even have people that really want to do it because we've been asking them over and over and over, and they want to do the right thing from a security perspective. But there are some behaviors that are just not humanly possible. One of those might be managing good, unique passwords across 200 different accounts. You just can't do it. Instead, you need a tool like a password manager or something like that to help cut down that cognitive load, get somebody into a better hygiene regimen there. So the other thing is that when we're designing for behavior, we need to be asking ourselves, what are the most important behaviors? Is this an umbrella term, or are there a lot of sub behaviors like this? Like phishing, I'd say, is an umbrella term. We have to teach people to interrogate links, interrogate headers, see if there are attachments, not enable macros if they download something. What about if it's BEC and there is no link within the email? That's a different set of behaviors and a different way of evaluating an email. And then also think about, are these behaviors that the organization has the appetite to work on right now, like tailgating? Some organizations, the security team really wants to stop tailgating, but the executive team likes to hold the door open for people. So you have to think about, are you going to cause political issues within the organization? You have to resolve those first before you work on the behavior. My book, I've got a lot of worksheets like this, but here's a quick example of one way of modeling behavior that's not security related. So something like drinking a glass of water. What are all the things that might affect motivation? What are the things that might affect ability? What are the prompts that might be given? The other thing is we need to realize that people are very emotional. They're story driven. They're driven by things that create images in our minds. And so the more we inject of that into our messaging, the more likely they are to retain it. And then ultimately, we need to find ways to push people into the right behavior, to naturally encourage them. So this example here with the urinal, this is encouraging better target practice, right? There's a fly etched in that. So they're trying to stop splashback. Landfill, you see the nastiness of that picture versus the cleanliness of recycling. You also see the immediate action, the immediate consequence of the action that somebody's going to take. Of course, giving to charity at the very end with that, at the time that somebody's already spending money, they're probably buying food for themselves. And then you're asking, do you want to help solve world hunger? And then, of course, what person probably wouldn't? And there's no extra action that's needed, really, other than just allocating that extra dollar. Password strength meters are a good example of this in the security world. But they're only as good as the algorithm. But I do think they're an effective use of nudging when they're done right. And then ultimately, anything you can do to increase motivation, make the thing be or feel easier at the time that you need somebody to do it, and then also really promote that message, get that prompt in there at the same time. So anytime you can do all three of these at once, you're really, really encouraging the behavior to happen. Then ultimately, it's about creating multiple channels over time so that you're hitting as many different ways that somebody can learn, some ways that somebody can receive information, and then ultimately building secure reflexes by doing continual testing, continual training, letting people fail safely or letting people create the right habits so that it becomes this thing that used to be really hard, used to be system 2, but it gets pushed into system 1 because it becomes much, much more natural. And then lastly, you want to add things like social pressures so that you think about the way that people work in context, how they codify knowledge into values and behaviors and so on. So with that, I know that I am out of time. I'll just do a quick plug for my book that goes into a lot of depth here, and then also my podcast. You can see and get familiar with a lot of the concepts that I talked about here through a lot of great guests on the podcast as well. And with that, I am officially out of time right now. So thank you so much.